Hi there, and welcome back, my friends. I want to take the opportunity to send my best wishes to all of you. I hope the holidays are enjoyable and bring you lots of cheerful memories. And if you are alone this Christmas, whether it's by choice or not, know this: you are not alone. Maybe physically, but not in spirit. Since I started this channel, it has been consuming me more and more. I find myself thinking about you guys all the time, and about how grateful I am for those of you who turn my videos on. I will surely be thinking about you over Christmas as well. I will take a couple of days off to be with my children, but I will come back around New Year's Eve with new fascinating videos. Well, enough of me blabbering. Let's get started. Part 1. The Corsican and the Revolutionary. Birth and Early Life. On August 15, 1769, in the sweltering heat of a Corsican summer, a child was born in the town of Ajaccio, who would reshape the map of Europe and leave an indelible mark on human history. His name was Napoleon Bonaparte, later to be known as Napoleon Bonaparte. Corsica itself was a land in transition. Just 15 months before Napoleon's birth, the island had been sold by the Republic of Genoa to France. The Corsican people, fiercely independent and resistant to foreign rule, had fought bitterly against French occupation under the leadership of Pasquale Paoli, a hero whom the young Napoleon would initially idolize. But by the time of Napoleon's birth, French authority had been established, albeit uneasily. Napoleon's family, the Bonapartes, were minor Corsican nobility, not wealthy, but possessing enough status to matter. His father, Carlo Bonaparte, was a lawyer and political opportunist who eventually made peace with the French authorities, a decision that would prove crucial to his children's futures. His mother, Letizia Ramolino, was a woman of remarkable strength and discipline, known for her frugality and firm hand in raising her 8 children, who survived to adulthood. Napoleon was the second surviving son, born into a household where resources were limited but ambition was not. Young Napoleon grew up speaking Corsican, a dialect closer to Italian than French. The island's culture was Mediterranean, tied more closely to Italy than to the French mainland. This created in the boy a sense of otherness, a feeling of being caught between worlds. He was Corsican first, and the French were occupiers. This identity would haunt him throughout his youth, even as he climbed the ranks of French military and political society. The family home in Ajaccio was modest but respectable. Napoleon's childhood was marked by the rough and tumble of island life, the Mediterranean sun, and the stories of Corsican resistance. But Carlo Bonaparte's decision to collaborate with the French administration opened doors that would have otherwise remained closed. Through his father's connections with the French governor, young Napoleon was granted a scholarship to attend military school in France, a rare opportunity for a Corsican boy of modest means. In the year of 1779, at the age of 9, Napoleon left Corsica for mainland France. He would spend 3 months at the College of Autun learning French before being sent to the Royal Military School at Brienne-le-Château in the Champagne region. The departure from his island home was a profound rupture. The boy who boarded that ship was Corsican to his core. The man who would emerge from the French military system would be something far more complex. Brienne was a harsh awakening. The school was designed to produce officers for the French Royal Army, and most of Napoleon's fellow students came from established French noble families. They mocked the short, thin Corsican boy with his thick accent and foreign ways. They called him names, ridiculed his poverty, and never let him forget that he was an outsider. Napoleon retreated into himself, becoming sullen and withdrawn. He channeled his isolation into furious study and reading. It was at Brienne that Napoleon discovered his true passion, military history and strategy. He devoured books, particularly the works of Plutarch, whose parallel lives of great Greeks and Romans fascinated him. He read Rousseau's political philosophy, absorbing ideas about the social contract and the rights of man. He studied mathematics and geography with intense focus. His instructors noted his exceptional aptitude for mathematics and his obsessive attention to military engineering and artillery tactics. subjects that required precision and analytical thinking. Napoleon spent 5 years at Brienne, from 1779 to 1784. During this time, he rarely saw his family. His father visited once. His mother never came. The loneliness deepened his introspection and his ambition. He wrote passionate essays, defending Corsican independence and praising Paoli. He dreamed of returning to Corsica as a liberator, driving out the French occupiers. The irony that he was being trained by the very military he hoped to defeat was not lost on him. In 1784, Napoleon was selected to continue his education at the prestigious École Militaire in Paris. It was at the time France's top military academy. This was an extraordinary achievement. The typical course of study took 2 years, but Napoleon completed it in just one, graduating in September 1785 at the age of 16. He ranked 42nd out of 58 graduates in his class. A respectable, if not outstanding, performance. His instructors noted his proficiency in artillery, a technical and mathematically demanding branch of the service that was often looked down upon by cavalry and infantry officers from aristocratic backgrounds. Napoleon was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the Lafayette Artillery Regiment, with a salary of 120 livres per year. It was a modest beginning, but it was a beginning nonetheless. The young officer was assigned to garrison duty in various French provincial towns, a period marked by long stretches of boredom, interrupted by intense reading and writing. He continued his self-education, reading philosophy, history, and political theory. He wrote essays, short stories, and even attempted a history of Corsica. But more importantly, Napoleon was developing his political consciousness. He read the Enlightenment thinkers, Voltaire, Montesquieu, and especially Rousseau. He was absorbing ideas about liberty, equality, and the rights of man. These were not abstract concepts to the young Corsican officer. They resonated with his own experiences of exclusion and his dreams of Corsican freedom. The French Revolution and early military service. Then came the year of 1789, and with it, an earthquake that would transform France and Europe, the French Revolution. The fall of the Bastille on July 14, 1789, marked the beginning of the revolutionary upheaval. The absolute monarchy of Louis XVI was challenged by demands for constitutional government, civil liberties, and social equality. The old order, the ancient regime of aristocratic privilege and feudal obligations, began to crumble. For Napoleon, now 20 years old, the revolution was electrifying. The ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity aligned with his own political thinking and his resentment of aristocratic privilege. But his initial response was complex. He was more concerned with Corsican affairs than French politics. When the revolution granted greater autonomy to Corsica, Napoleon saw an opportunity. He returned to the island repeatedly between 1789 and 1793, involving himself in local political struggles and attempting to join Paoli's movement. But Paoli, the great Corsican patriot, rejected Napoleon. He distrusted the Bonaparte family's connections to France and suspected Napoleon's motives. In 1793, as the revolution radicalized and France declared war on much of Europe, Paoli broke with revolutionary France and sought British protection for Corsica. Napoleon and his family, now committed to the French revolutionary cause, were forced to flee the island. They would never return to live there. Napoleon the Corsican patriot became, by necessity and conviction, Napoleon the French revolutionary. This was a turning point. Stripped of his Corsican identity, Napoleon threw himself fully into the service of revolutionary France. He even Gallicized his name from Napoleone de Bonaparte to Napoleon Bonaparte, shedding the Italian spelling as he had shed his island dreams. The Siege of Toulon. First taste of glory. Napoleon's opportunity for distinction came in the autumn of 1793, during one of the revolution's darkest hours. The revolution had radicalized. King Louis XVI had been guillotined in January 1793. France was at war with a coalition of European monarchies. Internally, counter-revolutionary uprisings threatened to tear the country apart. One of the most serious threats was at Toulon, France's most important Mediterranean naval base. In August 1793, royalist rebels in the city had invited British and Spanish forces to occupy the port. A combined fleet of British, Spanish, Neapolitan, and Sardinian ships held the harbor, and Allied troops occupied the fortifications. For the revolutionary government in Paris, the loss of Toulon was catastrophic. It gave Britain a strategic foothold in southern France and deprived France of a major naval base. The Revolutionary Army besieging Toulon needed artillery expertise. The officer, who had held the position of artillery commander, was wounded, and a replacement was urgently needed. Through a combination of circumstance and connection, his friendship with Augustin Robespierre, younger brother of the powerful Maximilien Robespierre, Napoleon was given the position. He was just 24 years old and held the rank of captain. Napoleon arrived at Toulon in September 1793 and immediately assessed the situation. The Allied forces held strong defensive positions around the harbor, with forts protecting the anchorage. The French revolutionary forces had been bombarding the city ineffectively for weeks. Napoleon saw what others had missed. The key to forcing the Allies out was not to attack the city itself, but to capture a promontory called Fort La Guillette, which dominated the inner harbor. If French artillery could be positioned there, the Allied fleet would be forced to evacuate, and without naval support, the ground forces would have to abandon the city. Napoleon presented his plan to the representatives on mission, civilian commissioners sent by the revolutionary government with extraordinary powers. He argued his case with such conviction and technical detail that he won their approval. He was promoted to major and given command of all artillery operations at the siege. Over the following weeks, Napoleon worked tirelessly. He organized the collection and positioning of heavy guns. He drilled the gunners. He supervised the construction of battery positions. He personally led reconnaissance missions and positioned batteries under enemy fire. His energy and competence impressed his superiors and the troops under his command. He was everywhere at once, demanding, driving, and leading by example. The assault on Fort La Guillette was launched on December 17, 1793. It was a night attack in foul weather, with wind and rain lashing the assault columns. Napoleon was in the thick of the fighting, personally directing artillery fire and rallying troops. He had a horse shot from under him and was wounded in the thigh by a British bayonet, but he refused to leave the field. By dawn, Fort La Guillette was in French hands. Napoleon immediately positioned his artillery on the captured promontory and opened fire on the Allied fleet in the harbor below. The effect was devastating. The ships were sitting targets. Within days, the British and Spanish forces evacuated Toulon by sea, and the Revolutionary Army entered the city on December 19, 1793. The recapture of Toulon was a major victory for the revolution, and Napoleon was its hero. The representatives on mission, including Augustin Robespierre, praised him effusively in their reports to Paris. He was promoted to brigadier general at the age of 24, an astonishing leap in rank. The young Corsican artillery officer had become a general of revolutionary France. But the revolution was a dangerous beast. Just months after Napoleon's triumph at Toulon, the political winds shifted. Maximilien Robespierre, the architect of the terror and the most powerful man in France, was overthrown and guillotined in the Coup of 9 Thermidor, July 27-28, 1794. Napoleon, associated with the Robespierres, fell under suspicion. He was briefly arrested and imprisoned, accused of conspiracy. For 2 weeks, his future, perhaps his life, hung in the balance. But Napoleon was released, his technical military skills deemed too valuable to waste. Nevertheless, his career stalled. He was assigned to command artillery in the Army of the West, fighting counter-revolutionary rebels, an unglamorous assignment that he tried to avoid. He even considered joining the Ottoman army as a military advisor. So frustrated was he with his prospects in France. Then came another turning point. In October 1795, A royalist uprising in Paris threatened the revolutionary government, now reorganized as the Directory. The government needed a military man who could suppress the rebellion decisively. Napoleon, unemployed and available in Paris, was given command of the forces defending the Tuileries Palace. On October 5, 1795, 13 Vendémiaire in the revolutionary calendar, Napoleon positioned his artillery in the streets and, when the royalist crowds advanced, gave the order to fire. His famous whiff of grape shot cut down the insurgents and saved the Directory. Once again, Napoleon's competence in a crisis earned him promotion and recognition. He was appointed commander of the Army of the Interior and promoted to divisional general. More importantly, he had proven his loyalty to the Directory and his willingness to use force decisively. The young general was now on the radar of France's political leadership. Napoleon was 26 years old. He had been born on an island that resented French rule, educated in schools where he was an outsider, and had survived the terror by sheer luck and competence. He had gone from artillery captain to general in just 2 years. He had tasted battle and victory. He had learned the importance of audacity and the decisive use of force. The Corsican had become the revolutionary, but the revolutionary was about to become something far greater: the conqueror. Part 2. The General and the Rise to Power. The Italian Campaign, 1796 to 1797. In March 1796, 26-year-old General Napoleon Bonaparte was given command of the Army of Italy. It was not a prestigious appointment. The Italian front was considered a sideshow compared to the main theaters of war along France's northern and eastern borders. The army he inherited was in terrible condition, undersupplied, underpaid, demoralized, and numbering only about 30,000 men. His soldiers were hungry, many were barefoot, and desertions were common. The officers, many older and more experienced than Napoleon, regarded their new commander with suspicion and resentment. But Napoleon saw opportunity where others saw hardship. Italy was divided into multiple states, many allied with or controlled by Austria, France's principal enemy. If Napoleon could defeat the Austrian and Piedmontese forces in northern Italy, he could knock Austria's Italian allies out of the war, seize their resources to feed and pay his army, and threaten Austria itself. Just 2 days before departing for Italy, Napoleon had married Josephine de Beauharnais, a widow, 6 years his senior, with 2 children from her first marriage. Josephine was a sophisticated Parisian socialite, a former aristocrat who had narrowly escaped the guillotine during the Terror, when her first husband was executed. Napoleon was utterly infatuated with her. Their courtship had been passionate and intense on his part. She seems to have been more calculating, seeing marriage to the rising young general as a path to security and social position. Nevertheless, the marriage took place on March 9, 1796, and Napoleon departed for Italy shortly thereafter, writing her passionate, almost obsessive love letters throughout the campaign. Napoleon arrived at his headquarters in Nice in late March and immediately began transforming his ragged army. He spoke to the soldiers, promising them glory, plunder, and the fertile plains of Italy if they followed him. He imposed iron discipline, but also led from the front, sharing their dangers and hardships. His energy was inexhaustible. He reorganized the supply system, improved the artillery train, and drilled the troops relentlessly. Then, in April 1796, Napoleon launched his offensive. His strategy was brilliant in its simplicity and daring. The Austrian and Piedmontese forces outnumbered him, but they were separated geographically. Napoleon would use speed and maneuver to strike between them, defeat them separately before they could unite, and drive deep into northern Italy. The campaign that followed was a masterclass in aggressive, mobile warfare. Napoleon moved with extraordinary speed, forcing his soldiers on grueling marches, but always arriving where the enemy least expected. He won a series of rapid victories. At the Battle of Montinati on April 12, 1796, he smashed an Austrian force. At the Battle of Digo on April 14-15, he defeated another Austrian army. At Mondovì, on April 21st, he crushed the Piedmontese. Within 3 weeks of opening his offensive, Napoleon had knocked the Kingdom of Piedmont-Sardinia out of the war. King Victor Amadeus III signed an armistice, ceding Nice and Savoy to France and granting French forces passage through his territory. It was an astonishing achievement. The army of Italy had gone from a demoralized rabble to a victorious force in less than a month. But Napoleon was just beginning. He now turned the full weight of his army against the Austrians in Lombardy. The Austrian commander, General Jean-Pierre Beaulieu, attempted to stop the French at the bridge over the Adda River at Lodi. The Battle of Lodi, fought on May 10, 1796, would become one of the legendary moments of Napoleon's career. The bridge at Lodi was long and narrow, swept by Austrian artillery on the far bank. To cross it under fire would be suicidal, yet Napoleon ordered the assault, leading from the front, according to legend, personally helping to maneuver a cannon. Napoleon urged his grenadiers forward. Under murderous fire, the French infantry charged across the bridge. It was a desperate, chaotic melee, but the French broke through. The Austrians retreated, and the road to Milan lay open. Lodi was not Napoleon's most strategically important victory, but it was psychologically crucial. The soldiers began to see their general as invincible, a man who led from the front and won impossible battles. They started calling him Le Petit Caporal, the Little Corporal, a term of endearment, recognizing his hands-on leadership. Napoleon himself later said that it was after Lodi that he began to see himself as a man destined for greatness. Not just a talented general, but a figure of world historical significance. On May 15, 1796, Napoleon entered Milan in triumph. The wealthy city of Lombardy submitted to French occupation. Napoleon imposed heavy requisitions, extracting money, supplies, and artwork to send back to Paris. The Directory, desperate for funds and impressed by Napoleon's victories, gave him free rein. Northern Italy became a source of plunder that enriched France and bought Napoleon political capital at home. But the Austrians were far from defeated. They sent reinforcements and launched counteroffensives. The war in Italy dragged on through the summer and autumn of 1796. Napoleon besieged and captured the fortress city of Mantua after a grueling siege lasting from June 6 to February 1797. The Austrians launched multiple attempts to relieve Mantua, and Napoleon fought a series of brutal battles to stop them. At the Battle of Arcole, fought from November 15th to 17th, 1796, Napoleon again displayed his flair for dramatic personal leadership. French forces were bogged down trying to cross a bridge over the Alpone River in the face of fierce Austrian resistance. At a critical moment, according to eyewitnesses and legend, Napoleon seized a flag and charged onto the bridge himself, rallying his troops to follow. He nearly drowned when he fell into the muddy marshland beside the bridge. The battle was a confused, close-run affair, but the French eventually prevailed, and the Austrians retreated. The decisive victory came at the Battle of Rivoli on January 14-15, 1797. Austrian General Alvinci launched a major offensive to relieve Mantua with nearly 30,000 troops. Napoleon, with slightly fewer men, met him on the heights above Rivoli. Through skillful positioning and aggressive counterattacks, Napoleon shattered the Austrian army, inflicting over 14,000 casualties. It was a crushing defeat for Austria. Mantua surrendered on February 2, 1797, and the road to Vienna itself lay open. Austria sued for peace. Napoleon, acting far beyond his authority as a field commander, negotiated directly with the Austrians. The resulting Treaty of Campo Formio, signed on October 17, 1797, was a triumph for France. Austria recognized French control of Belgium and the west bank of the Rhine and ceded Lombardy to the newly created French puppet state, the Cisalpine Republic. In exchange, France allowed Austria to annex the Republic of Venice, cynically ending 1,000 years of Venetian independence. Napoleon returned to Paris in December 1797 as the most famous man in France. He was just 28 years old. In 18 months, he had transformed a ragged, defeated army into a victorious force, conquered northern Italy, defeated multiple Austrian armies, and dictated terms to one of Europe's great powers. He returned to Paris laden with loot, paintings, sculptures, manuscripts, and glory. The Directory, which had sent him to Italy as a junior general, now faced a popular hero who might eclipse them. The Egyptian Campaign, 1798 to 1801. Napoleon's fame posed a political problem. The Directory recognized his military genius, but feared his ambition. They needed to find a way to employ him that would keep him away from Paris and French domestic politics. Napoleon himself was restless. Italy had been conquered. He needed a new theater for glory. The solution was Egypt. The strategic rationale for invading Egypt was to strike at British interests in the eastern Mediterranean and potentially threaten Britain's access to India, the jewel of its empire. France and Britain were locked in a global struggle for supremacy. Britain's naval power made a direct invasion of the British Isles nearly impossible, but if France could establish a presence in Egypt, it might sever Britain's communications with India and open the door to further conquests in the east. There were also romantic and cultural motives. Egypt, with its ancient civilization and legendary monuments, captivated the European imagination. Napoleon, who fashioned himself as a new Alexander the Great, dreamed of Oriental conquest and Enlightenment mission. He assembled not just an army, but a commission of scholars, mathematicians, engineers, naturalists, linguists, to study and document Egypt. This was to be as much a scientific and cultural expedition as a military campaign. In May 1798, a French fleet carrying over 30,000 troops and the scientific commission sailed from Toulon. Napoleon commanded the expedition. The fleet stopped at Malta, which Napoleon captured with barely a shot fired, before continuing to Egypt. The crossing of the Mediterranean was perilous. The British Royal Navy, commanded by Admiral Horatio Nelson, was hunting for the French fleet. But Napoleon's ships evaded detection. On July 1st, 1798, the French army landed near Alexandria, Egypt. Napoleon quickly captured the city and then marched south toward Cairo, the seat of Mamluk power in Egypt. Egypt was nominally part of the Ottoman Empire, but real power lay with the Mamluks, a warrior caste of slave soldiers who had ruled Egypt for centuries. The decisive confrontation came on July 21, 1798, at the Battle of the Pyramids, fought near the village of Mbabihi, within sight of Cairo and the Great Pyramids. The Mamluk army, commanded by Murad Bey and Ibrahim Bey, numbered perhaps 20,000 cavalry and infantry. The Mamluks were renowned horsemen, and their cavalry charges were legendary for ferocity. Napoleon formed his infantry into massive squares, hollow formations with soldiers facing outward, bristling with bayonets, and supported by artillery at the corners. When the Mamluk cavalry charged, they broke against these squares like waves against a rock. French musket volleys and artillery fire cut down the horsemen in droves. The Mamluk infantry and fellahin, peasant levies, fared no better. By the end of the day, the Mamluk army was shattered. French casualties were minimal. Napoleon, before the battle, had told his soldiers, "From the heights of these pyramids, 40 centuries look down upon you." It became one of history's most famous battlefield speeches. Napoleon entered Cairo on July 24, 1798, and established himself as master of Egypt. He attempted to present himself as a liberator and friend of Islam, even hinting at his own sympathy for Islamic principles. He established a French administration, reformed the tax system, and set his scholars to work studying Egyptian antiquities and society. But disaster struck. On August 1st, 1798, Admiral Nelson's fleet found the French ships anchored in Aboukir Bay, near the mouth of the Nile. In the Battle of the Nile, also called the Battle of Aboukir Bay, Nelson attacked at dusk and achieved one of the most complete naval victories in history. The French fleet was destroyed. Of 17 French warships, 11 were captured or destroyed. Napoleon and his army were stranded in Egypt, cut off from France, and surrounded by hostile forces. The situation deteriorated further. The Ottoman Empire, alarmed by the French invasion of its Egyptian province, declared war on France. Ottoman armies advanced from Syria and from the Red Sea. Napoleon decided to strike first. In February 1799, he marched north into Syria with about 13,000 men, intending to capture Ottoman bases and preempt an invasion. The Syrian campaign was a disaster. Napoleon captured the coastal cities of Gaza and Jaffa, but the siege of Jaffa was particularly brutal. After the city fell on March 7, 1799, French troops massacred thousands of Ottoman prisoners and inhabitants. It was a stain on Napoleon's reputation. The army then besieged the fortress city of Acre, but the city, defended by Ottoman forces and advised by a French royalist émigré officer and supplied by the British Royal Navy, held out. After 2 months of fruitless siege and suffering from plague, Napoleon abandoned the siege on May 20, 1799, and retreated to Egypt. Back in Egypt, Napoleon faced an Ottoman army that had landed at Abukir. On July 25, 1799, Napoleon counterattacked and destroyed the Ottoman force at the Battle of Abukir, a land battle, not to be confused with the naval battle of the previous year. It was a victory, but it could not change the strategic reality. The Egyptian expedition was failing. The army was wasting away from disease, heat, and guerrilla attacks. French control extended little beyond the major cities, and news from France indicated that the Directory was in crisis, facing military defeats in Europe and political chaos at home. Napoleon made a fateful decision. On August 22, 1799, he secretly boarded a frigate and abandoned his army, sailing back to France. He left command to General Jean-Baptiste Kleber, who would be assassinated in Cairo the following year. Napoleon's departure was, in effect, a desertion, but he gambled that his fame and the political situation in Paris would protect him. The gamble paid off. Napoleon landed in France on October 9, 1799, and the news of his return electrified the country. The failures of the Egyptian campaign were downplayed or unknown. What mattered was that the hero of Italy had returned when France needed him most. Despite the military failure, the Egyptian expedition left a lasting cultural legacy. The scholars Napoleon had brought documented Egypt's monuments, natural history, and society in the monumental description de l'Egypte, published over decades. Most famously, in 1799, French soldiers discovered the Rosetta Stone, a granite stele inscribed with the same text in Greek, Demotic, and hieroglyphics. Its eventual decipherment by Jean-François Champollion in the 1820s unlocked the secrets of ancient Egyptian writing and inaugurated the modern field of Egyptology. The Coup of 18 Brumaire. November 9-10, 1799, Napoleon returned to a France in crisis. The Directory, the 5-man executive committee that had governed since 1795, was despised and weak. France was at war with the Second Coalition of European powers: Britain, Austria, Russia, and others. French armies had suffered defeats. The economy was in shambles. Corruption and incompetence plagued the government. Political factions schemed constantly. Many believed that only a strong man could save France from chaos or a royalist restoration. Napoleon was that man. Or rather, he was seen as that man by the conspirators who were already planning a coup to overthrow the Directory. Chief among these was Emmanuel Joseph C.S., himself one of the 5 directors and a political theorist who had played a key role in the early revolution. CS wanted to replace the Directory with a stronger executive, but needed a general with troops and popularity to ensure the coup's success. Napoleon, fresh from Egypt and basking in public adulation, was the perfect instrument. Napoleon was cautious, but ambitious. He met with Sieyès and the other conspirators. He understood that the coup was his path to supreme power, but he also knew the risks. If the coup failed, he could face the firing squad. The coup was set for 18 Brumaire, year A8 of the revolutionary calendar. November 9th, 1799. In the conventional calendar, the conspirators spread rumors of a Jacobin plot to justify emergency measures. The Council of 500, the lower house of the legislature, and the Council of Ancients, the upper house, were summoned to an emergency meeting, not in Paris, but at the royal palace of St. Cloud, outside the city, ostensibly for their safety. Napoleon was appointed commander of the troops in Paris, giving him control of military forces. On the morning of November 9th, the plan unfolded. The Council of Ancients, dominated by conspirators, voted to move to St. Cloud and place Napoleon in command of the Paris garrison and the legislature's guard. 3 of the 5 directors resigned under pressure. The other 2 were placed under house arrest. So far, the coup had succeeded without violence. But the next day, November 10th, matters nearly collapsed. Napoleon appeared before the Council of 500 to explain the emergency and demand that the Directory be dissolved. But the deputies, many of them committed Republicans, were outraged. They saw through the charade and shouted, "Outlaw him! Down with the dictator!" Some deputies physically attacked Napoleon, and he was hustled from the chamber, shaken, and possibly injured. The coup hung in the balance. It was Napoleon's brother Lucien Bonaparte, president of the Council of 500, who saved the situation. Lucien left the chamber and addressed the troops outside, warning them that assassins had attacked his brother and that the deputies were in thrall to a foreign conspiracy. Napoleon, recovering his nerve, reinforced the message. He ordered the troops, commanded by General Joachim Murat, to clear the chamber. Soldiers with fixed bayonets entered the hall. The deputies fled in panic, some jumping out of windows. That evening, a rump session of compliant deputies voted to dissolve the Directory and establish a new government, the consulate, headed by 3 consuls. Napoleon was named first consul, with C.S. and Roger Ducos as second and third consuls. In reality, Napoleon held all the power. The coup of 18 Brumaire was complete. Napoleon famously quipped, "We have finished the romance of the revolution. We must now begin its history." At 30 years old, he was the effective dictator of France. The consulate and Napoleon's reforms, 1799 to 1804. As first consul, Napoleon moved quickly to consolidate power and stabilize France. He was a ruthless political operator, but also a visionary reformer. Over the next 5 years, he transformed French government, law, and society in ways that would outlast his regime and influence the modern world. Politically, Napoleon crafted a constitution. The Constitution of the Year 8, spelled with Roman letters, that concentrated power in his hands while maintaining a republican facade. There were legislative assemblies, but they had little real power. Napoleon appointed ministers, judges, and generals. He controlled the army. He used a combination of patronage, propaganda, and police surveillance to suppress opposition. Yet he also sought legitimacy through plebiscites, public votes that ratified his rule with overwhelming majorities. Though these were hardly free or fair elections, Napoleon made peace with France's internal and external enemies. He crushed the royalist rebels in the Vendée through a combination of military force and amnesty. He offered pardons to émigrés, aristocrats who had fled France during the Revolution, if they returned and swore loyalty. He centralized the administration, appointing prefects to govern France's departments with iron discipline. His greatest domestic achievement was the Napoleonic Code, formally titled the Civil Code of 1804. This was a comprehensive codification of French civil law, replacing the patchwork of feudal, royal, and revolutionary laws that had governed different regions. Napoleon personally presided over many of the sessions of the commission drafting the code. The code enshrined key revolutionary principles: equality before the law, the abolition of feudal privileges, protection of property rights, and secular authority over religious institutions in matters of civil law. However, the code was also conservative in significant ways, particularly regarding family and gender. It reinforced patriarchal authority, giving husbands extensive control over wives and property. Women lost many of the rights they had gained during the Revolution. Nevertheless, the Napoleonic Code was revolutionary in its clarity, accessibility, and rationality. It became a model for legal systems across Europe and Latin America and remains the foundation of French law today. In 1801, Napoleon negotiated the Concordat with Pope Pius VII. The Catholic Church had been devastated by the revolution. Churches closed, priests persecuted, land confiscated. The Concordat restored the Church's position in France, but firmly subordinated it to state authority. Catholicism was recognized as the religion of the majority of French citizens, but not as the state religion. The state would pay clerical salaries, but the government would nominate bishops, whom the Pope would then appoint. Church lands confiscated during the Revolution remained in the hands of their new owners. The Concordat was a pragmatic compromise that stabilized relations between church and state and won Napoleon the support of conservative Catholics. Napoleon also reformed education, establishing the lycées, secondary schools, and the University of France to train administrators and military officers loyal to the state. He reformed the financial system, creating the Bank of France in 1800 to stabilize currency and credit. He invested in infrastructure, roads, bridges, canals, to facilitate commerce and military movement. On the battlefield, Napoleon continued his winning streak. He returned to war with Austria in 1800, launching a daring campaign over the Alps into northern Italy. On June 14, 1800, at the Battle of Marengo, Napoleon defeated the Austrians in a hard-fought battle that hinged on the timely arrival of reinforcements under General Louis Desaix, who was killed in the fighting. Marengo restored French control over northern Italy and led to the Treaty of Luneville in February 1801, which reconfirmed French gains. Britain remained at war, but by 1802, exhaustion on both sides led to the Treaty of Amiens, a temporary peace that ended hostilities between France and Britain. For the first time in a decade, Europe was at peace. France was dominant on the continent, and Napoleon was its unchallenged master. In 1802, Napoleon was made consul for life in another plebiscite. But being first consul was not enough. Napoleon's ambitions and the logic of his position pointed toward one inevitable destination: the throne. Part 3. Emperor of the French and Zenith of Power. The coronation, December 2, 1804. On May 18th in the year of 1804, the Senate proclaimed Napoleon Emperor of the French. A plebiscite held in November 1804 ratified the decision by an overwhelming margin, though, as with previous votes, the result was carefully managed. Napoleon Bonaparte, the son of minor Corsican nobility, the artillery officer who had risen through revolutionary chaos, was now to be crowned emperor. The coronation was scheduled for December 2, 1804, at Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. Napoleon understood the power of spectacle and symbolism. This would not be a simple ceremony. It would be a statement to France and to Europe that a new imperial dynasty had been founded, that the revolution's chaos had given way to order and glory under Napoleon's rule. Pope Pius X was persuaded to travel from Rome to Paris to officiate at the coronation, lending religious legitimacy to Napoleon's rule. The Pope's presence was a coup. No pope had traveled outside Italy for such a purpose in centuries. Yet Napoleon made clear that this was not a medieval coronation, where divine authority flowed from the church to the monarch. This was a modern ceremony, where Napoleon's authority came from his achievements and the will of the French people. The ceremony was magnificent. Notre Dame was decorated in imperial splendor. Napoleon wore a purple velvet mantle embroidered with golden bees, an imperial symbol he had chosen to replace the Bourbon fleur-de-lis. His wife Josephine, whom he had married in a civil ceremony in 1796, now underwent a secret religious marriage the night before, at Napoleon's insistence and the Pope's requirement. At the critical moment of the ceremony, Napoleon took the crown from the altar, not from the Pope's hands, and placed it on his own head. Then he crowned Josephine as empress. The message was unmistakable. Napoleon crowned himself. He owed his throne to no one but his own genius and achievements. The great painter Jacques-Louis David immortalized the moment in his massive canvas, The Coronation of Napoleon. though David diplomatically depicted Napoleon crowning Josephine rather than himself. Napoleon was 35 years old. In 15 years, he had gone from an obscure Corsican artillery officer to Emperor of the French. But the empire he had proclaimed existed in a hostile world. Britain remained unreconciled to French dominance. Austria, Russia, and Prussia watched nervously. War would come again, and soon. The War of the Third Coalition and the Battle of Austerlitz. 1805. The Treaty of Amiens collapsed in 1803, and Britain and France returned to war. Napoleon assembled a massive army, the Grande Armée, at Boulogne on the English Channel, and planned an invasion of Britain. For 2 years, French troops trained and prepared, while Napoleon's fleet attempted to achieve the naval superiority necessary for a cross-channel invasion. But Britain was not idle. Prime Minister William Pitt, the younger, orchestrated the Third Coalition against France, bringing together Britain, Austria, Russia, and Sweden. The coalition members agreed to coordinate their attacks and bring overwhelming force to bear against Napoleon. In August 1805, Napoleon learned that Austria and Russia were mobilizing for war. The Austrian army was marching west toward Bavaria, a French ally. Napoleon faced a strategic dilemma. If he remained at Boulogne preparing to invade England, the coalition armies would overwhelm his German allies and potentially invade France itself. He made his decision with characteristic speed and boldness. The invasion of Britain was postponed indefinitely. The Grande Armée would march east to destroy the coalition before it could unite. On August 27, 1805, Napoleon broke camp at Boulogne and began one of history's most brilliantly executed strategic maneuvers. He marched 7 corps of the Grande Armée, over 200,000 men, across France and into Germany with astonishing speed and coordination. The Austrians, commanded by General Karl Mack, had advanced into Bavaria and were waiting near the city of Ulm for Russian reinforcements. Napoleon moved faster than Mack anticipated, using his corps system, semi-independent divisions that could march separately but converge for battle. Napoleon executed a vast wheeling movement that positioned French forces behind the Austrian army, cutting Mack's communications and line of retreat. By October 15, 1805, Mack found himself surrounded at Ulm. On October 20th, he surrendered with over 25,000 troops. Napoleon had destroyed an entire Austrian army without fighting a major battle. It was a masterpiece of maneuver warfare. Napoleon pressed on, entering Vienna on November 13, 1805. But the main Russian army under General Mikhail Kutuzov had evaded him and was retreating northward, awaiting reinforcements. Napoleon pursued, but he was now far from his bases. His supply lines stretched thin and facing the combined might of Russia and Austria. Yet Napoleon saw opportunity in his apparent vulnerability. He deliberately positioned his army near the town of Austerlitz in Moravia, today's Czech Republic, occupying a seemingly weak position. He sent out peace feelers, hinting at desperation. He abandoned the strategic Pratzen Heights, a commanding plateau dominating the battlefield. He wanted the Allied commanders, Russian Tsar Alexander I and Austrian Emperor Francis II, to believe he was weak and desperate, to lure them into attacking. The bait worked. The Allied army, numbering approximately 85,000 Russians and Austrians, advanced to attack Napoleon's 73,000 troops on the morning of December 1805, exactly 1 year after Napoleon's coronation. The Battle of Austerlitz, known as the Battle of the Three Emperors, because Napoleon, Alexander I, and Francis II were all present, would become Napoleon's greatest tactical masterpiece. The Allied plan was to outflank Napoleon's right wing by advancing through the valley south of the Pratzen Heights, then roll up his army and cut off his retreat. In the pre-dawn mist of December 2nd, the Allied columns descended from the Pratzen Heights and moved south to execute their flanking maneuver. It was exactly what Napoleon had anticipated. He had deliberately weakened his right wing to tempt the Allies into this attack, while concealing strong forces in the center. As the Allies abandoned the Pratzen Heights to execute their flanking move, Napoleon launched his main attack. At approximately 9:00 a.m., as the winter sun burned through the mist, Napoleon unleashed Marshal Jean de Dieu Soult's IV Corps in a massive assault up the slopes of the Pratzen Heights. Soult's troops stormed the plateau, seizing the commanding terrain that the Allies had vacated. The French now held the center of the battlefield and had cut the Allied army in two. The southern wing of the Allied army, which had descended into the valleys to outflank Napoleon's right, found itself trapped between Napoleon's right wing and the frozen ponds and marshes around the village of Sachton. French artillery pounded the ice, and thousands of Russian soldiers drowned or froze in the frigid water as they tried to escape. It was a slaughter. On the northern part of the battlefield, the Russian Imperial Guard launched a desperate counterattack to retake the Pratzen Heights. For a time, the fighting was intense and the outcome uncertain. But Napoleon committed his own Imperial Guard, and the Russian attack was repulsed. By afternoon, the Allied army was in full retreat. Russian and Austrian casualties numbered approximately 27,000 killed, wounded, or captured. French casualties were around 9,000. It was a decisive, crushing victory. Tsar Alexander fled the battlefield in tears. Emperor Francis II sued for peace. The Treaty of Pressburg, signed on December 26, 1805, imposed harsh terms on Austria. Austria ceded Venice, Istria, and Dalmatia to Napoleon's Kingdom of Italy, and territories in southern Germany to Napoleon's German allies, Bavaria and Württemberg. Austria also had to pay a massive indemnity. The Holy Roman Empire, that medieval relic that had existed for over 1,000 years, would be formally dissolved within a year, replaced by Napoleon's Confederation of the Rhine. A collection of German states under French protection, Austerlitz was Napoleon's crowning military achievement. He had outmaneuvered and outfought a numerically superior enemy, turning their own plan against them with devastating effect. His reputation as a military genius reached its zenith. Across Europe, people spoke of Austerlitz as they had once spoken of Alexander's victories or Caesar's campaigns. But even as Napoleon celebrated his greatest triumph, a shadow had fallen over French arms. Trafalgar, October 21, 1805. While Napoleon was marching into Germany in the autumn of 1805, France's naval fortunes met with disaster. Napoleon's plan to invade Britain had required achieving temporary naval superiority in the English Channel. To accomplish this, the French and Spanish fleets, Spain was France's ally, were to lure the British Royal Navy away from European waters, then double back and concentrate in the Channel, providing cover for the invasion barges. The plan went disastrously wrong. The combined Franco-Spanish fleet, commanded by French Admiral Pierre-Charles Villeneuve, was pursued by the British Mediterranean Fleet under Vice Admiral Lord Horatio Nelson, Britain's greatest naval commander. After an abortive attempt to support French operations in the Caribbean, Villeneuve retreated to the Spanish port of Cadiz, where Nelson blockaded him. In October 1805, under pressure from Napoleon to break out and do something useful, Villeneuve sailed from Cadiz with 33 French and Spanish ships of the line. Nelson, with 27 ships, intercepted the combined fleet off Cape Trafalgar on the Spanish coast. The Battle of Trafalgar, fought on October 21, 1805, was one of the most decisive naval engagements in history. Nelson employed an unorthodox tactic. Instead of forming a traditional line of battle parallel to the enemy, he divided his fleet into two columns and drove them perpendicular to the Franco-Spanish line, breaking it in two places. This exposed the leading British ships to devastating enemy fire as they approached. But once through the enemy line, the superior gunnery and seamanship of the Royal Navy told. The battle was a slaughter. The British captured or destroyed 22 enemy ships without losing a single vessel of their own. But the victory came at a terrible price. Nelson, directing the battle from the deck of his flagship HMS Victory, was struck by a French sniper's bullet. He died below deck several hours later, just as victory was assured. His last words, after being told of the scale of the British triumph, were reportedly, "Now I am satisfied. Thank God I have done my duty." Trafalgar ended any realistic possibility of a French invasion of Britain. British naval supremacy was absolute, and would remain so for over a century. Napoleon would never be able to challenge Britain at sea. The war between France and Britain would continue, but it would be fought on land, through blockades and economic warfare, not through invasion. Napoleon received news of Trafalgar just days before Austerlitz. He suppressed the reports and minimized the defeat in official bulletins. The glory of Austerlitz overshadowed the disaster at Trafalgar in French public opinion. But strategically, the implications were profound. Britain remained untouchable in her island fortress, free to subsidize continental coalitions against France and to dominate global trade and colonial possessions. The continental system. Unable to invade Britain, Napoleon sought to strangle it economically. In 1806, following his victories over Austria and the crushing of Prussia at Jena-Auerstedt, Napoleon proclaimed the continental system, also known as the Continental Blockade. The Berlin Decree, issued on November 21, 1806, forbade the importation of British goods into any territory controlled by France or its allies. All British merchandise was to be seized. No ships coming from Britain or its colonies were to be allowed into continental ports. Napoleon's strategy was to close Europe's markets to British exports, crippling British trade and manufacturing, and ultimately forcing Britain to sue for peace. In retaliation, Britain issued orders in council declaring that neutral ships trading with France or its allies would be seized unless they first stopped at a British port and paid duties. Napoleon responded with further decrees from Milan in 1807, declaring that any ship that submitted to British regulations would be treated as British and subject to seizure. The continental system was economically ambitious, but practically difficult to enforce. It required the cooperation, willing or forced, of every European state with a coastline. Smuggling was rampant. Many French merchants and even Napoleon's own marshals and officials violated the blockade when it suited them. The system caused real hardship for Britain, particularly in 1808 and 1811 to 1812, when British exports declined and unemployment rose. But Britain's global trading network and its naval dominance allowed it to find alternative markets in Latin America and Asia. The continental system also inflicted pain on the continent. Cutting off British goods meant cutting off colonial products. Sugar, coffee, cotton, that European consumers wanted. Industries dependent on British raw materials or markets suffered. Resentment grew, especially in countries forced into the system against their will. The logic of the continental system would drive much of Napoleon's foreign policy in the years after 1806. To make the blockade effective, Napoleon needed to control all of Europe's coasts. This imperative would lead him to annex additional territories, impose the system on reluctant allies, invade Spain when it proved unreliable, and ultimately march into Russia when Tsar Alexander began to evade the blockade. The continental system, intended as a weapon against Britain, became a trap that drew Napoleon into overreach and ultimate disaster. Jena-Auerstedt and the destruction of Prussia, 1806. The Fourth Coalition against France formed in 1806, led by Prussia, Russia, Saxony, and Sweden, with British financial support. Prussia, humiliated by its exclusion from previous peace settlements and alarmed by Napoleon's reorganization of Germany, issued an ultimatum demanding French withdrawal from German territories. Napoleon's response was swift and devastating. On October 14, 1806, the Grande Armée engaged the Prussian army in two simultaneous battles. Jena and Auerstedt fought only miles apart. At Jena, Napoleon personally commanded approximately 96,000 troops against what he believed was the main Prussian army under Prince Friedrich Ludwig of Hohenlohe-Ingelfingen, numbering around 38,000. Napoleon won a crushing victory, shattering the Prussian force. At Auerstedt, Marshal Louis-Nicolas Davout, with just 27,000 men, encountered and defeated the actual main Prussian army of 63,000 under King Frederick William III and the Duke of Brunswick. Davout's victory was one of the most remarkable feats of the Napoleonic Wars. Outnumbered more than 2-1, he held his ground and ultimately routed the Prussians. The Duke of Brunswick was mortally wounded in the battle, The twin battles destroyed the Prussian army as a fighting force. Napoleon pursued relentlessly. Within weeks, French forces occupied Berlin. The Prussian fortresses, which should have held out for months, surrendered with shocking rapidity, their commanders paralyzed by the speed and scale of the catastrophe. By the end of October, Prussia, which had been Frederick the Great's great power just a generation earlier, was prostrate at Napoleon's feet. Napoleon remained in Germany through the winter, fighting a brutal campaign against the Russian army in the mud and snow of Poland and East Prussia. The battles of Eylau, February 7-8, 1807, and Friedland, June 14, 1807, were costly but ultimately victorious for the French. The Battle of Eylau in particular was extraordinarily bloody, with perhaps 25,000 French and 15,000 Russian casualties in a chaotic winter melee that Napoleon himself later described as a massacre. The Treaty of Tilsett, July 1807. After the French victory at Friedland, Tsar Alexander of Russia sought peace. Napoleon, his armies exhausted and far from France, was willing to negotiate. The result was one of the most dramatic diplomatic encounters in history. The meeting between Napoleon and Alexander on a raft in the middle of the Niemen River near the town of Tilsett on June 25, 1807. The two emperors met without advisors, speaking for hours. Napoleon, the Corsican artillery officer turned emperor, and Alexander, the aristocratic autocrat of all the Russias, formed a personal bond, or at least the appearance of one. They divided Europe between them like the world was their chessboard. The treaties of Tilsit, signed in July 1807, redrew the map of Europe. Prussia was stripped of half its territory. Napoleon created the Grand Duchy of Warsaw from Prussian Poland, a French satellite state that threatened Prussia and alarmed Russia. The Kingdom of Westphalia was carved from Prussian and other German territories and given to Napoleon's brother Jérôme as a throne. Russia recognized Napoleon's dominance in Western and Central Europe. In return, France recognized Russia's interests in Finland and the Ottoman territories. Most significantly, Russia agreed to join the continental system against Britain. For a moment, Napoleon seemed to have achieved his goal. He dominated the continent from the Atlantic to the Niemen River. He had forced peace on his terms with every major continental power. His brothers and marshals ruled kingdoms and principalities across Europe. Only Britain remained defiant, isolated on its island, its navy controlling the seas, but unable to challenge Napoleon on land. Napoleon was at the zenith of his power. He was 37 years old in 1807, master of Europe, adored by his soldiers, feared by kings. The painter Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres would later depict him as Napoleon I on his imperial throne, enthroned like a Roman emperor or a Byzantine icon, the embodiment of absolute power. But beneath the surface of triumph, the seeds of disaster were already sprouting. The continental system required enforcement, and enforcement required constant expansion and intervention. Napoleon's family members, placed on thrones across Europe, proved unreliable and incompetent. Resistance to French rule was growing, and in Spain, a catastrophe was about to unfold that would bleed the French Empire white and demonstrate that Napoleon, for all his genius, was not invincible. The Peninsular War, the Spanish ulcer, 1808 to 1814. Spain had been France's ally since 1796, a junior partner in Napoleon's continental system. But by 1807, Napoleon had grown frustrated with Spanish weakness and unreliability. The Spanish Bourbon monarchy was corrupt and ineffectual. King Charles IV was dominated by his wife and her favorite, Manuel de Godoy. Napoleon saw an opportunity to bring Spain fully under French control. In 1807 to 1808, under the pretext of occupying Portugal, Britain's ally, and enforcing the continental blockade, Napoleon marched French troops into Spain. Then, through a combination of manipulation and coercion, he forced the Spanish royal family to abdicate. In a meeting at Bayonne in May 1808, Napoleon announced that his brother Joseph Bonaparte would be the new king of Spain. The Spanish Bourbons were pensioned off. Napoleon believed he had secured Spain without a fight. He was catastrophically wrong. The Spanish people rose in rebellion. On May 2, 1808, riots broke out in Madrid against the French occupation. French troops brutally suppressed the uprising, executing hundreds of Spanish civilians. The painter Francisco Goya would later immortalize the horror in his masterpieces, the 2nd of May 1808 and the 3rd of May 1808, depicting both the popular resistance and the French firing squads. The uprising in Madrid sparked a nationwide rebellion. Across Spain, juntas, local governing bodies, declared loyalty to the deposed Ferdinand VII and resistance to the French occupiers. Spanish regular troops joined the rebellion. Most significantly, the Spanish people engaged in guerrilla warfare, a term that comes from the Spanish guerrilla, meaning little war. The guerrilla warfare in Spain was vicious and unrelenting. Spanish irregulars ambushed French supply columns, assassinated collaborators, and melted back into the population or the mountains. The French responded with savage reprisals, burning villages and executing suspects. But terror only hardened Spanish resistance. For every guerrilla killed, 2 more took up arms. In July 1808, a French army under General Pierre Dupont was surrounded and forced to surrender at Bailaine by Spanish regular forces. Over 20,000 French troops marched into captivity. It was the first major defeat of Napoleon's Grande Armée on land, and the psychological impact was enormous. French invincibility had been shattered. Britain, seeing an opportunity, sent an expeditionary force to Portugal under Sir Arthur Wellesley, later the Duke of Wellington. The British Army would fight in the Iberian Peninsula for the next 6 years, tying down hundreds of thousands of French troops. Napoleon himself marched into Spain in November 1808 with 200,000 reinforcements. He rapidly drove back Spanish armies and recaptured Madrid, but he could not destroy the British army or suppress the guerrillas. After just 3 months in Spain, Napoleon returned to France in January 1809, alarmed by Austrian rearmament. He left his marshals to finish the job in Spain. They never did. The Peninsular War became a running sore that drained French resources. At any given time, between 200,000 and 300,000 French troops were tied down in Spain and Portugal, fighting an enemy they could neither defeat nor conciliate. French soldiers called Spain the Spanish ulcur. The British, under Wellington, proved to be formidable opponents. Wellington was a defensive genius, choosing strong positions and using the terrain to negate French numerical superiority. At battles such as Talavera, 1809, Buzaco, 1810, Salamanca, 1812, and Vitoria, 1813, Wellington defeated French forces or fought them to a standstill. He established defensive lines, the lines of Torres Vedras, that protected Lisbon and provided a secure base for British operation. The Spanish guerrillas, supported by British gold and weapons, continued their relentless campaign. French communications were constantly disrupted. Isolated garrisons were besieged. Collaborators were killed. The French could control the cities and the main roads, but the countryside belonged to the guerrillas. The Peninsular War was a strategic disaster for Napoleon. It demonstrated that popular resistance could undermine even the most powerful military machine. It gave British forces a foothold on the continent. It tied down troops desperately needed elsewhere, and it emboldened Napoleon's enemies, showing that the French could be beat. Napoleon would later call Spain the Spanish ulcer that ruined him. He was not far wrong. The Russian Campaign, 1812. By 1812, Napoleon's relationship with Tsar Alexander had deteriorated. The alliance forged at Tilsett had been based on mutual interest, but those interests were diverging. Russia chafed under the continental system, which damaged Russian trade. Alexander was alarmed by Napoleon's recreation of Poland in the Grand Duchy of Warsaw. Napoleon suspected Alexander of secretly trading with Britain. Napoleon decided that only a massive military demonstration, or conquest, could bring Russia back into line. and secure his eastern flank. He assembled the largest army Europe had ever seen. The Grand Armée of 1812 numbered approximately 685,000 men. It included not just Frenchmen but Poles, Germans, Italians, Dutch, Swiss, Austrians, and troops from across Napoleon's empire and satellite states. It was a multinational force, united only by Napoleon's will and reputation. On June 24, 1812, Napoleon's massive army crossed the Niemen River and invaded Russia. The stated goal was to force Alexander to rejoin the continental system and accept French dominance. Napoleon expected a short campaign, a single decisive battle that would bring the Russians to terms, as Austerlitz had done in 1805. But the Russians refused to give him that battle. The Russian armies, commanded by generals Mikhail Barclay de Tolly and Pyotr Bagration, retreated before the French advance, drawing Napoleon deeper into Russia's vast spaces. The Russians implemented a strategy of scorched earth, burning crops and supplies, denying the French the ability to live off the land. Napoleon's army advanced rapidly in the summer heat, covering hundreds of miles. But the logistics of supplying such an enormous force over such distances were nightmarish. The roads were terrible. Supplies from French depots in Poland and Germany could not keep pace with the advance. Horses died by the thousands. Soldiers began to desert or fall out from exhaustion, hunger, and disease. By the time Napoleon reached Smolensk in mid-August, he had lost perhaps 150,000 men without fighting a major battle. The decisive engagement finally came on September 7, 1812, at the village of Borodino, about 75 miles west of Moscow. The Russians, now commanded by General Mikhail Kutuzov, established strong defensive positions and resolved to make a stand. The Battle of Borodino was one of the bloodiest single days of combat in the Napoleonic Wars. Napoleon attacked with approximately 130,000 men and 587 guns against Kutuzov's 120,000 Russians and 640 guns. The battle was a brutal slugging match. French columns assaulted Russian earthwork fortifications throughout the day, facing withering artillery and musket fire. The Russians counterattacked repeatedly. Entire divisions were destroyed. The Great Redoubt, a massive Russian fortification at the center of their line, changed hands in savage fighting. By nightfall, the French held the battlefield, but at a horrific cost. French casualties numbered approximately 30,000 to 35,000. Russian casualties were even higher, perhaps 45,000 to 50,000. Napoleon had won a tactical victory, but he had not destroyed the Russian army. Kutuzov retreated in good order, his force still intact as a fighting unit. A week later, on September 14, 1812, Napoleon entered Moscow. He expected the fall of Russia's ancient capital would force Alexander to negotiate. But Moscow was largely deserted. That night, fires broke out across the city. Whether set by Russian patriots or by accident in the chaos, the fires raged for days, destroying 3/4 of the city. Napoleon and his army occupied a blackened ruin. Napoleon waited in Moscow for over a month, sending messages to Alexander, offering peace terms. But the Tsar refused to negotiate. The French army, camped in and around Moscow, was consuming its supplies and accomplishing nothing. The Russian army, far from being destroyed, was regrouping and receiving reinforcements. And winter was coming. On October 19, 1812, Napoleon ordered the retreat from Moscow. It was already too late. The army that left Moscow numbered perhaps 100,000 men, already drastically reduced from the force that had crossed the Niemen. The retreat rapidly became a nightmare. Russian forces harassed the French columns constantly. Cossack cavalry picked off stragglers. Partisans attacked supply trains. But far worse than the Russians was the weather. The Russian winter of 1812 arrived early and struck with brutal force. Temperatures plunged below freezing. Blizzards swept the plains. Men froze to death by the thousands. Horses died, leaving artillery and wagons stranded. Discipline collapsed. The Grand Armée disintegrated into a starving, freezing mob. The crossing of the Beresina River, from November 26-28, 1812, was the nadir. Russian forces had destroyed the bridges, trapping the French on the eastern bank with enemy armies converging from 3 directions. French engineers, working in the icy water, managed to construct 2 makeshift bridges. Over 2 desperate days, the remnants of the Grand Armée, along with thousands of civilians and camp followers, struggled across the narrow bridges while Russian artillery pounded them. Thousands drowned or were killed. Thousands more were captured when the bridges collapsed. Napoleon himself abandoned the army on December 5, 1812, racing ahead by sleigh to return to Paris. He left Marshal Joachim Murat in command of the wreckage. When the shattered remnants of the Grand Armée finally staggered out of Russia in December, fewer than 40,000 combat-effective soldiers remained from the 685,000 who had invaded. It was the greatest military catastrophe in history to that point. The Russian campaign destroyed Napoleon's aura of invincibility. The myth of the unbeatable general was broken. And worse, it demonstrated that France's military resources were not inexhaustible. The flower of Napoleon's army, his veterans, his elite units, his cavalry, had been annihilated in the snows of Russia. The War of the Sixth Coalition and the Battle of Leipzig, 1813. Europe smelled blood. With Napoleon's army destroyed in Russia, his enemies moved quickly. Russia, Prussia, Sweden, Austria, and Britain formed the Sixth Coalition. Napoleon's German allies began to defect. The Grand Duchy of Warsaw collapsed. Even Austria, whose emperor's daughter Marie-Louise had married Napoleon in 1810, joined the coalition against him. Napoleon showed extraordinary resilience. Through forced conscription, he raised a new army in France. Young, inexperienced troops, but still an army numbering over 200,000. In the spring and summer of 1813, he fought a series of battles in Germany, winning victories at Lutzen, May 2, and Botzen, May 2021. But he could not deliver the knockout blow that had characterized his earlier campaigns. His new army lacked the cavalry and experienced soldiers necessary to turn battlefield victories into decisive results. An armistice in summer 1813 gave both sides time to regroup, but it worked against Napoleon. The coalition armies grew stronger, now coordinated under a unified strategy devised by the Austrian general Karl Philipp zu Schwarzenberg. They avoided facing Napoleon directly, instead attacking his marshals and wearing down French forces in smaller engagements. In October 1813, the coalition armies converged on Leipzig in Saxony, where Napoleon had concentrated his forces. The Battle of Leipzig, fought from October 16–19, 1813, became known as the Battle of the Nations for the number of countries involved. It was the largest battle in European history before World War I. Napoleon commanded approximately 195,000 troops. Arrayed against him were over 365,000 coalition soldiers. Russians, Prussians, Austrians, and Swedes. The odds were overwhelming. The battle raged for 3 days. Napoleon fought with skill and determination, but he could not overcome the numerical disadvantage. On October 18th, Saxon troops in Napoleon's army defected to the coalition mid-battle, turning their guns on the French. By October 19th, Napoleon recognized that the position was untenable. He ordered a retreat. The retreat turned into a rout. A single bridge over the Ulster River was the only escape route for the French army. In the chaos, a French corporal prematurely blew up the bridge, trapping thousands of French soldiers on the wrong side. Many drowned trying to swim the river. Tens of thousands were captured. Marshal Józef Poniatowski, the Polish commander, drowned in the river. Napoleon's losses at Leipzig exceeded 70,000 men killed, wounded, or captured. The coalition losses were around 54,000. Heavy, but they could afford it. Napoleon could not. The Grand Armée retreated westward toward the Rhine, harried by coalition cavalry. Napoleon's German allies abandoned him. The Confederation of the Rhine dissolved. By the end of 1813, Napoleon had been driven out of Germany. The coalition army stood poised to invade France itself. The campaign in France and first abdication. 1814. In January 1814, coalition armies crossed the Rhine and invaded France. Napoleon, with a hastily assembled force of raw recruits and veterans, fought one of the most brilliant defensive campaigns of his career. Outnumbered and outgunned, he used interior lines and rapid movement to defeat coalition detachments at battles such as Champaubert, Montmirail, and Montereau. But he could not stop the relentless advance. Paris fell to coalition forces on March 31, 1814. Napoleon's marshals and political leaders, seeing the hopelessness of the situation, pressured him to abdicate. Napoleon's empire was collapsing around him. His generals were exhausted, and his soldiers demoralized. On April 6, 1814, Napoleon abdicated unconditionally. The Treaty of Fontainebleau, signed on April 11, 1814, provided generous terms. Napoleon retained his imperial title and was granted sovereignty over the island of Elba, a small island off the coast of Tuscany. He was given an annual pension of 2 million francs from the French government and allowed to take a guard of 400 volunteers. Josephine, from whom he had divorced in 1809 to marry Marie-Louise of Austria, retained her title and properties. Marie-Louise and their son, Napoleon's heir, were sent to Austria. The Bourbon monarchy was restored in France under Louis VIII, brother of the executed Louis XVI. On May 4, 1814, Napoleon landed on Elba and began his exile. He was 44 years old. From master of Europe to ruler of a tiny island. It seemed the end of an extraordinary career. But Napoleon was not finished. The escape from Elba and the return. March 1815. Napoleon's exile on Elba was comfortable, but confining. He governed the island with energy, improving roads, reorganizing administration, and drilling his small guard. But his mind was on France. News from the continent was disturbing. The restored Bourbon monarchy was unpopular. The French resented the arrogance of returning émigrés and the dismantling of Napoleon's reforms. The army, in particular, chafed under Bourbon rule. Veterans remembered glory under Napoleon and felt humiliated by the restoration. Moreover, Napoleon learned that the Congress of Vienna, where the victorious powers were redrawing the map of Europe, was in disarray. The Allies were quarreling over territory, particularly Poland and Saxony. There was talk of war between Russia and Prussia on one side and Britain and Austria on the other. Napoleon saw opportunity in this discord. He also had personal grievances. The French government had failed to pay the pension promised in the Treaty of Fontainebleau. His wife and son were virtual prisoners in Austria. He heard rumors that the British planned to exile him to a more remote location, possibly Saint Helena in the South Atlantic. On February 26, 1815, Napoleon made his decision. That evening, he boarded the brig Inconstant with about 1,000 soldiers of his guard and a handful of loyal officers. They evaded the British naval vessels patrolling the area and set sail for France. On March 1, 1815, Napoleon landed at Gulf Juan on the French Mediterranean coast. He had returned. What followed became known as the Flight of the Eagle, or the March to Paris, one of the most remarkable episodes in military and political history. Napoleon began his march north toward Paris with his small force. The Bourbon government sent troops to intercept him, but Napoleon had gambled on the loyalty of the French army, and his gamble paid off spectacularly. At every encounter with royalist forces, Napoleon approached personally, often alone, opened his coat to expose his chest, and declared, "Soldiers of the 5th Regiment, if there is one among you who wishes to kill his emperor, here I am." The soldiers refused to fire. Regiment after regiment defected to Napoleon. At Grenoble, the garrison joined him without a shot. Marshal Michel Ney, who had pledged to King Louis VIII that he would bring Napoleon back to Paris in an iron cage, instead embraced his former emperor and brought his troops over to Napoleon's side. The march became a triumphal procession. Crowds cheered Napoleon's passage. By the time he reached Paris on March 20, 1815, his tiny force had swelled to thousands. King Louis VIII had fled to Belgium. Napoleon entered the Tuileries Palace and resumed power. He had reconquered France in just 20 days without firing a shot, but Europe would not allow it. The Congress of Vienna immediately declared Napoleon an outlaw and enemy of the world. The Seventh Coalition formed. Britain, Prussia, Austria, Russia, and others mobilized their armies. Over 700,000 coalition troops would march against France. Napoleon had perhaps 280,000 men, many of them raw recruits or veterans who had survived previous campaigns. Napoleon understood that his only chance was to strike first, before the coalition armies could unite. He decided to attack the nearest coalition forces. The British army under the Duke of Wellington in Belgium, and the Prussian army under Field Marshal Gebhard Leberecht von Blücher, also in Belgium. If he could defeat them separately before the Austrians and Russians arrived from the east, he might force a negotiated peace. It was a desperate gamble, but Napoleon had no other choice. The period known as the 100 Days was racing toward its climax. The Waterloo Campaign, June 1815. On June 15, 1815, Napoleon crossed the border into Belgium with approximately 128,000 troops. His plan was audacious: drive between Wellington's and Blücher's armies, defeat them in detail, and seize Brussels. Speed and surprise were essential. Initially, the plan worked. Napoleon's sudden offensive caught the coalition forces off guard. The French drove north, engaging Prussian forces at the crossroads of Quatre Bras and Ligny. On June 16th, Napoleon fought two separate battles. At Ligny, Napoleon personally commanded the main French force against Blücher's Prussians. After a day of fierce fighting, the French broke the Prussian center with a massed assault of the Imperial Guard at dusk. The Prussians retreated in some disorder, having suffered approximately 25,000 casualties. Blücher himself, 72 years old, was trapped under his dead horse during a cavalry charge and narrowly escaped death. It was Napoleon's last battlefield victory. Meanwhile, at Quatre Bras, Marshal Ney engaged Wellington's forces in an indecisive battle. Ney had received contradictory orders from Napoleon and failed to concentrate his forces effectively. Wellington's army held the crossroads and then withdrew northward the next day to link up with the Prussians. Napoleon had won a tactical victory at Ligny, but he had failed to destroy either enemy army. The Prussians were bloodied but intact. Wellington's army was untouched and in a strong defensive position. And crucially, the two Allied armies remained in communication and capable of supporting each other. On June 17th, Napoleon pursued Wellington's retreating army. Wellington chose to make a stand on a low ridge near the village of Waterloo, about 10 miles south of Brussels. The position was strong, a gentle reverse slope that protected his infantry from artillery fire, with the main road to Brussels behind him. Wellington had approximately 68,000 troops, including British, Dutch, Belgian, and German contingents. Napoleon arrived with about 72,000 men. He was confident. Wellington's polyglot army seemed inferior to French veterans. The British were trapped with their backs to Brussels. One decisive battle, and Napoleon would shatter the coalition. But Napoleon made a crucial miscalculation. He believed the Prussians had been so badly beaten at Ligny that they were retreating eastward, away from the battlefield. In fact, Blücher was marching toward Waterloo to reinforce Wellington. If the Prussians arrived in time, Napoleon would face not 68,000 enemies, but over 120,000. The Battle of Waterloo, June 18, 1815. The morning of Sunday, June 18, 1815, dawned wet and muddy. Heavy rain during the night had turned the fields into a quagmire. Napoleon delayed his attack until mid-morning to allow the ground to dry, believing this would make it easier for his artillery to maneuver and his cavalry to charge. That delay would prove fatal. The battle began around 11:30 a.m. with a French diversionary attack on the Château de Hougomont, a fortified farmhouse on Wellington's right flank. Napoleon intended this as a feint to draw Wellington's reserves to that sector. But the attack escalated into a savage, all-day struggle. British guards and German troops held the chateau against repeated French assaults. Thousands of men died fighting over walls, gardens, and courtyards. The diversion consumed far more French troops than Napoleon intended. At 1:30 p.m., Napoleon launched his main attack against Wellington's center-left. 4 French infantry divisions, over 16,000 men, advanced in massive columns toward the ridge. Wellington's infantry, deployed in lines along the reverse slope, were largely hidden from French view. As the French crested the ridge, they were met with devastating volleys from British infantry at close range. The French columns recoiled. Then, at Wellington's order, 2 brigades of British heavy cavalry, the Household Brigade and the Union Brigade, charged the retreating French infantry. It was a spectacular success. The British cavalry smashed through the French columns, capturing 2 French Eagles, regimental standards, and reaching the French artillery positions. But the cavalry, intoxicated by success, charged too far. French lancers and cavalry counterattacked. The British cavalry was cut to pieces. Of approximately 2,500 British heavy cavalry who had charged, fewer than 1,000 returned. The Scots Greys, one of the most famous regiments, was virtually annihilated. By mid-afternoon, the initial French attacks had been repulsed, but at heavy cost to both sides. Then Napoleon received alarming news. Prussian forces had been sighted approaching from the east. Blücher's army was arriving. Napoleon had to break Wellington's line before the Prussians arrived in force, or he would be trapped between 2 armies. At approximately 4 p.m., Marshal Ney launched a massive cavalry charge against Wellington's center. Perhaps 5,000 French cavalry, cuirassiers in their steel breastplates, dragoons, lancers, thundered up the slope toward Wellington's ridge. It was a magnificent but futile display. Wellington's infantry formed squares, hollow rectangular formations with soldiers facing outward, bristling with bayonets. The French cavalry crashed against these squares repeatedly, but could not break them. British artillery, positioned between the squares, fired canister shot at point-blank range, cutting down horses and riders. The cavalry charges continued for over an hour, wave after wave, but the squares held. Without infantry or artillery support, cavalry alone could not break formed infantry. By 6 p.m., the situation was desperate for Napoleon. Prussian forces under General Friedrich Wilhelm von Bülow were attacking his right flank, engaging the French corps commanded by Marshal Emmanuel de Grouchy, who had been detached to pursue the Prussians but had lost contact with the main Prussian force. More Prussian formations were arriving by the hour. Wellington's line was battered but unbroken. Napoleon had one card left to play: the Imperial Guard, his elite veteran troops, the finest soldiers in his army, who had never been defeated in battle. At approximately 7:00 p.m., Napoleon committed the Middle and Old Guard, about 5,000 men, in a final desperate attack against Wellington's center. The Guardsmen advanced through the carnage and smoke, climbing the ridge in disciplined columns. They were met by British Guards, brigades positioned in line. At close range, the British opened fire with devastating volleys. For the first time in their history, the Imperial Guard faltered. The British Guards then charged with the bayonet. The Imperial Guard broke and retreated. The cry went up, "La Garde recule! The Guard retreats!" Across the battlefield, French soldiers heard the unthinkable. If the Imperial Guard could be beaten, all was lost. Panic spread through the French army. At that moment, Wellington, who had been observing from near the center of his line, waved his hat in the air, the signal for a general advance. The entire Anglo-Allied line surged forward. Simultaneously, the Prussians broke through on the French right flank. The French army disintegrated into a fleeing mob. What had been an organized battle became a rout. Napoleon attempted to rally the Old Guard, forming them into squares to cover the retreat, but even they could not stem the tide. As night fell, the remnants of the French army streamed south in chaotic retreat, pursued by Prussian cavalry, who showed no mercy. Blücher personally led the pursuit, urging his exhausted men to give the French no time to reorganize. The Battle of Waterloo was over. It had lasted approximately 9 hours. French casualties numbered approximately 25,000 killed and wounded, with another 8,000 captured. Wellington's army suffered about 15,000 casualties, and the Prussians around 7,000. But the strategic result was total. Napoleon's last army was destroyed. The 100 days were over. Second abdication and exile to Saint Helena. Napoleon fled the battlefield and reached Paris on June 21, 1815. He hoped to rally the nation for continued resistance, but the political will had collapsed. The legislature demanded his abdication. His marshals and ministers abandoned him. On June 22, 1815, Napoleon abdicated for the second time, this time in favor of his son, Napoleon II, though the boy would never rule. Napoleon initially planned to escape to America, where he might live in exile. He traveled to the Atlantic port of Rochefort, but British naval vessels blockaded the harbor. Seeing no other option, Napoleon surrendered to Captain Frederick Maitland of HMS Bellerophon on July 15, 1815. He wrote to the Prince Regent of Britain, appealing to British hospitality and comparing himself to Themistocles seeking protection from his enemies. The British government had no intention of allowing Napoleon to live in comfort in Britain or escape to America. They decided to exile him to the most remote location possible, Saint Helena, a tiny volcanic island in the South Atlantic Ocean, over 1,000 miles from the nearest landmass. It was one of the most isolated places on Earth. Napoleon arrived at St. Helena on October 15, 1815, and was confined to Longwood House, a damp, windswept residence plagued by rats and termites. The British garrison commander, Sir Hudson Lowe, treated Napoleon as a prisoner, not as a deposed sovereign. Lowe enforced petty restrictions and insisted that Napoleon be addressed as General Bonaparte, not as Emperor. The relationship between Napoleon and Lowe was one of constant antagonism. Napoleon's household at Longwood included a handful of loyal followers, who had chosen to accompany him into exile. General Henry Gratien Bertrand and his wife, the Comte de Montholon and his wife, General Gaspard Gourgaud, and Emmanuel de Las Cases, who would record Napoleon's memoirs. The days passed in boredom, bickering, and nostalgia. Napoleon dictated his memoirs, justifying his actions, and constructing the Napoleonic legend. He gardened, played cards, and argued with his companions. His health deteriorated. He suffered from stomach pain, nausea, and progressive weakness. By early 1821, it was clear that he was dying. Napoleon made his will, distributing his few possessions and leaving messages for his son. On May 5, 1821, at approximately 5:49 p.m., Napoleon Bonaparte died at Longwood House. He was 51 years old. His last words were variously reported, but they seem to have included references to the army and to his son. France, armée, tête d'armée, Joséphine. The exact cause of death was disputed. The official British autopsy attributed death to stomach cancer. Some of Napoleon's followers suspected poisoning, either deliberate or from arsenic in the wallpaper. Modern analysis tends to support the cancer diagnosis, though the debate continues. Napoleon was buried on St. Helena, in a simple grave in a valley he had chosen. His wish to be buried on the banks of the Seine in France was denied. He would not return to France until 1840, when King Louis-Philippe arranged for Napoleon's remains to be exhumed and brought back to Paris. On December 15, 1840, Napoleon's body was interred at Les Invalides, the military hospital and monument in Paris, where it remains today beneath a magnificent tomb. Legacy and historiography. The military genius. Napoleon Bonaparte was one of history's greatest military commanders. In nearly 20 years of campaigning, he fought approximately 60 battles and lost only 7. He revolutionized warfare through his use of corps systems, allowing armies to march separately and concentrate rapidly for battle. He understood logistics, although his neglect of supply lines in Russia proved catastrophic. He was a master of maneuver and concentration of force, bringing overwhelming power to bear at decisive points. His victories, Austerlitz, Jena, Friedland, are studied in military academies worldwide. His strategic concepts influenced military thinking throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. Generals from Clausewitz to Eisenhower studied Napoleon's campaigns. But Napoleon's military legacy is also one of cautionary tales. The dangers of overextension, the limits of military power against popular resistance, and the fatal consequences of strategic overreach. The legal and administrative reformer. Beyond the battlefield, Napoleon's most enduring legacy is the Napoleonic Code. This comprehensive civil law code emphasized clarity, accessibility, and rational organization of legal principles. It abolished feudal privileges, confirmed property rights, and established the principle of equality before the law. The code's influence spread far beyond France. It became the basis for legal systems in Belgium, the Netherlands, Italy, Spain, Portugal, and much of Latin America. Louisiana's civil law system is based on the Napoleonic Code. Even today, over 50 nations have legal systems directly or indirectly influenced by Napoleon's codification. Napoleon's administrative reforms also proved lasting. The prefectural system of centralized administration, the reorganization of education, the concordat with the Catholic Church, and the creation of the Bank of France all survived his fall and shaped modern France. The metric system, promoted and standardized under Napoleon, became the global standard for weights and measures. The Legion of Honor, created to reward merit and service, remains France's highest decoration. The destroyer and builder of nations. Napoleon's impact on the map of Europe was profound. He destroyed the Holy Roman Empire, ending a political structure that had existed since the 9th century. He redrew the borders of Germany and Italy, consolidating hundreds of small states into larger units that would eventually become modern Germany and Italy. The nationalism he both exploited and provoked would shape 19th and 20th century European history. His continental system, though ultimately ineffective, demonstrated the possibility of economic warfare on a continental scale. His creation of satellite kingdoms and republics established models of dependent statehood that would recur throughout modern history. But Napoleon was also a destroyer. His wars killed an estimated 3 to 6 million people, both soldiers and civilians. Entire regions of Spain, Germany, and Russia were devastated. The trauma of Napoleonic warfare contributed to the conservative reaction of the post-1815 period and shaped European politics for generations. The symbol and the legend. Perhaps Napoleon's greatest achievement was creating his own legend. During his exile on Saint Helena, he carefully crafted his memoirs and legacy, portraying himself as a champion of the revolution, a defender of liberty against reactionary monarchies, and a victim of British jealousy and continental treachery. This Napoleonic legend proved immensely powerful. Throughout the 19th century, Napoleon was idolized by liberals and nationalists across Europe as a symbol of revolutionary change and meritocracy. In France, Napoleon became a contested symbol. Republicans viewed him with ambivalence. He had preserved revolutionary principles, but destroyed republican government. Bonapartists celebrated him as a model of strong leadership and national glory. His nephew, Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, successfully exploited this legacy, becoming Napoleon III, Emperor of the French from 1852 to 1870. Artists, writers, and composers were fascinated by Napoleon. Beethoven initially dedicated his Third Symphony to Napoleon as a champion of liberty, though he angrily removed the dedication when Napoleon crowned himself emperor. Tolstoy's War and Peace grappled with Napoleon's role in Russian history. Countless paintings, sculptures, novels, poems, and later films depicted Napoleon, making him one of the most represented figures in art and popular culture. Historical debates. Historians have debated Napoleon's significance and character for 2 centuries. Was he a genius or a tyrant? A champion of the revolution or a betrayer of its ideals? A visionary reformer or a megalomaniacal warmonger? The evidence supports elements of all these characterizations. Napoleon was undeniably brilliant, a military genius, an able administrator, a legal reformer of lasting importance. He opened careers to talent regardless of birth, spreading revolutionary principles of equality and meritocracy across Europe. He preserved many gains of the French Revolution while providing stability after years of chaos. But he was also an autocrat who destroyed republican government and established a police state. He caused wars that killed millions and devastated Europe. His ambition and refusal to accept limits led to catastrophic defeats and unnecessary suffering. He restored slavery in French colonies, which the Revolution had abolished, a moral stain on his legacy. Perhaps the fairest assessment is that Napoleon was a figure of contradictions, a product of both the Enlightenment and of military culture, a revolutionary who created an empire, a modernizer who relied on autocratic methods, a man of extraordinary genius, an extraordinary ambition whose very successes led to his ultimate failure. The final reckoning. Napoleon Bonaparte rose from obscurity to become master of Europe, crowned himself emperor, reshaped nations, rewrote law codes, and commanded armies in battles that determined the fate of millions. He stands as one of the pivotal figures in modern history, comparable to Julius Caesar, Charlemagne, or Alexander the Great in impact and legend. His legacy is complex and contested. The Napoleonic Code remains a foundation of modern law. The administrative systems he created still function. The nationalism he unleashed would reshape the world. Yet his wars also devastated Europe and led to decades of conservative reaction. For 20 years, Napoleon's will shaped European destiny. He transformed warfare, government, and law. He inspired devotion and hatred, admiration and fear. He built an empire that briefly encompassed most of Western and Central Europe, then saw it collapse in Russian snows and on Belgian fields. In the end, Napoleon was defeated not by lack of genius, but by the impossibility of his ambition. One man, however brilliant, could not permanently dominate a continent against the will of its peoples. His empire, built on military victory, could not survive military defeat. The old monarchies he had overthrown returned, their restoration guaranteed by British gold and Russian soldiers. Yet even in defeat and exile, Napoleon remained a figure of fascination and power. His legend outlived his life. His reforms outlasted his rule, and his name became synonymous with military genius, imperial ambition, and the revolutionary transformation of Europe. From a small island off the coast of Italy to the throne of France. From France to Egypt's pyramids. From the pyramids of Egypt to the gates of Moscow. From triumph at Austerlitz to defeat at Waterloo. From the cheers of Paris to lonely exile on Saint Helena. Napoleon's life spanned the entire spectrum of human ambition, achievement, and tragedy. He was born Napoleon Bonaparte, a Corsican outsider in French military schools. He died Napoleon Bonaparte, former emperor of the French, on a remote island prison. In between, he changed the world. History remembers few individuals so completely, so controversially, and so enduringly as Napoleon Bonaparte. Love him or hate him, admire his genius or condemn his tyranny, one thing is certain. Napoleon Bonaparte was one of the most significant figures in human history, and his shadow still falls across our modern world.